Okay, so I'm Ted Haberman, and happy to welcome you to this session on identifying ESIP. This is actually a report out from a Funding Friday project that California Digital Library and I and DataSite were lucky enough to be awarded last summer. We're going to talk about organizational identifiers. So we all know, many of us know how important DOIs are, and we know how important ORCIDs are. The new lion on the block is the Research Organization Registry and ROR identifiers. And the goal of this project was to try and help ESIP members become familiar with ROR. We're going to have two presentations. Maria Gould from the California Digital Library is going to give us an intro, and then she is the project manager for ROR, so she can answer questions about ROR. And then after Maria's done, I'll show you some of the results that we have. And if you go to the URL that I showed earlier, we'll see it again. You have an opportunity to find the ROR that is appropriate for you and your organization. So without further ado, Maria Gould, project manager for ROR at California Digital Library. All yours, Maria.
Thank you very much, Ted. Hello, everyone. I'm Maria Gould, as Ted introduced me, and thanks for having me crash your session today and beam me in from the West Coast. So as Ted mentioned, I'm here to give you a kind of crash course in ROR. Some of you might already be familiar, some of you may not be. So we'll just cover the basics, talk about what we've been up to and where we're going next, and kind of set you up for the adventure that Ted will lead you on after I'm done. So starting with a little bit of context and kind of setting the scene and framing the problem. I am at California Digital Library, which is basically the system-wide library for the University of California library system. The University of California is a massive, massive university system, and UC researchers produce by some accounts, approximately 10% of all of the research published in the United States. But being able to track research outputs, whether it's research by the University of California, by some of its campuses, or by any other institution, is becoming increasingly more important, but also increasingly more challenging as we see a proliferation of digital scholarship on various platforms and in various sources and indexes. And one of the reasons why that's challenging is because of the ways in which researcher affiliations are collected or are not collected in some cases. And that involves a lot of disambiguation of free text affiliation fields, or trying to access affiliation data that may be locked in a commercial database, or in some cases, trying to wade through research outputs and identify affiliations when the publisher or the platform hosting that research hasn't even collected the researcher's affiliation at all. So while this work is increasingly more important, whether it's for university administrative reporting or funding applications, grant reports, open access policies, understanding the impact of library licensing negotiations with publishers and more, we all need this kind of data, but it's increasingly challenging to get it. So taking the example of University of California, Berkeley, you can write in a free text field UC Berkeley's name in any number of ways. To give a few examples here, you can write it with a comma, you can write it with a dash, or you can abbreviate it as UC Berkeley or any other variant. And it's really difficult if you're trying to wade through a list of affiliations to make sense of this without having a single point of identification that can link all of these different name variants together. So that's kind of where the concept of a ROR ID really shows its promise and its power. So what I'm showing on the slide right now is the ROR ID for UC Berkeley. So all of those different ways of writing UC Berkeley can essentially be rolled up into a single persistent identifier. So ROR is the Research Organization Registry, and this is a community-led project to develop an open, sustainable, usable, and unique identifier for every research organization in the world. And as Ted was kind of alluding to, ROR is emerging in this space where in the world of open and digital scholarship, we have kind of solved the problem of how to identify research outputs. We have DOIs for articles and for data sets that make it easier and more efficient to track and to discover online publications and other research objects. We've also kind of solved the problem of how to identify the people who are involved in the research process, because we have ORCID identifiers that can uniquely identify the contributors and creators of research. But until now, we kind of had this missing piece of the puzzle, which was how to identify the organizations and institutions that were affiliated with these research outputs. So without really being able to complete the circle, we could really only go so far in the effort to track and to discover and to organize research outputs by institution. So the promise of ROR is really being in being able to complete that circle and to be able to tie all of these identifiers together in order to glean more meaningful and powerful information out of it. So coming back to the mission statement for the ROR project, I'm just going to highlight a few things that are kind of shaping our mission and the type of work that we are engaged in at this moment. And the first is that this is really a community-driven project. So ROR is not the first identifier for organizations to ever exist. That's not a flag that we're trying to wave, but it's really trying to do something different in being driven and led by community needs, meaning what is the kind of data that's really meaningful and useful for the community of researchers, research administrators, universities, libraries, etc. That also means that the project itself is being led as a partnership of different community-based organizations. So that includes California Digital Library, as well as Crossref and DataCite. We're also partnering as part of this community effort with Digital Science, which actually gave ROR its kickstart in donating a seed data set for ROR to build upon, which I'll talk about in a minute. The second really important element to ROR is that we're building open infrastructure. So all of the data is available under a CC0 license. All of our code is open, and that is going to be in perpetuity. You know, we firmly believe that institutions shouldn't have to pay to access their own data, and so that spirit of openness is also really central to the project. And the third point that I want to highlight is that ROR is specifically focused on identifying research organization affiliations, meaning it's not meant to be a registry of every single legal entity that exists in the world. It's really focused on what are the organizations that are affiliated with research outputs. We're also focused at identifying these affiliations mainly at the top level. So that means it's not a mapped hierarchy of academic departments within a given institution, for instance. So that's kind of framed the story of how ROR has emerged and our reason for being and what we're trying to do. So now I'm going to share a little bit about what we've actually done so far. So we have the ROR registry up and running right now. There are approximately 97,000 organizations in the registry. As I mentioned a moment ago, we started with the grid data set of organizations, and that kind of allowed ROR to have a kickstart. We're now starting the process to build on that over time and to develop our own independent workflows for managing that data. So as Ted will kind of walk you through later, you can look up organizations right now in ROR's search function. So I've put the URL on the screen. And if you look up an organization, you can see the different types of metadata that we're collecting about each organization in the registry. So first and foremost, the ROR ID itself, which I've highlighted on the screen. This is a URL that resolves to the ROR record. We're also capturing basic metadata like the name of the organization, any alternate names, abbreviations, names in different languages. We support multiple languages, the URL, and we map ROR IDs to other identifiers that also exist for the organization. So as part of being open infrastructure, it's really important that ROR IDs are interoperable with any other IDs that may be out there. So you can see those captured in this example as well, that the ROR ID for the Department of Transportation is also mapping to the GRID ID, to ISNI, the Crossref Funder ID, and to Wikidata. We are capturing the location, at this point the country. We'll be able to get a little bit more granular later on, and the type of organization as well. So in addition to the registry itself, we also have some tools that are openly available for people to interact with the ROR data and start doing things with it. So starting with the ROR API that is publicly available, all of the code is on GitHub. We have built some functionality into the ROR API to allow people to run full text strings through the API and match them to a ROR ID. We know this is increasingly important for data scientists, for research administrators, librarians who might have a long list of affiliations already and want to clean those up. So you can start in this example here with an affiliation like this Department of Civil and Industrial Engineering at the University of Pisa. You can run an API query with that affiliation string, and what will come out of that is it will find a match to the ROR ID for University of Pisa. So this animation here, I'm not sure how easy it is for those of you in the room to see, and apologies if it's challenging, but I'll narrate in gripping detail. There's an animation showing how that same API query that I just walked you through is happening in real time. So another tool that we have for interacting with ROR data is a reconciler that works with OpenRefine. So a little bit similar in principle to the previous example. You can run a list of affiliations through the reconciler, and it will find matches to ROR IDs. So it's just an easy way to kind of clean up messy data sets and end up with clean and disambiguated institutional data. We have all of the JSON files for the ROR data available in a Figshare repository. So that's another kind of need that community members expressed, was wanting to be able to work with the entire data file. So we're making those publicly available on a regular basis. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about ROR in action. So I'm showing an example here of one of the first integrations with ROR, which was just released in September when Dryad relaunched its data publishing platform. And so Dryad previously had never collected affiliations for researchers submitting data sets. And so when they were preparing to relaunch their platform, they wanted to collect affiliations, and they wanted to collect affiliations in a structured way, as opposed to just having it be an open free text field. So they integrated an API lookup to the ROR database, so that when researchers are submitting a data set, when they start typing into the affiliation box, the system will actually start looking for a match in the ROR data set. And so in that way, Dryad can have affiliations for all of its data sets, both prospectively and retroactively. And it means that all of those affiliations are going to be tied to a unique ROR ID, which is collected in the background. So this is something that's kind of invisible to the researcher. It's baked into the Dryad system, making it, as seamless as possible, and allows Dryad to have clean and consistent data for all of their data sets. Taking that one step further, Dryad sends all of its metadata to DataCite. And so the DataCite metadata schema, as of this past summer, now supports ROR IDs. And so that means that all of the ROR IDs that Dryad is collecting can now be indexed in DataCite. So the examples I'm showing on this slide show what that can look like in the metadata. And taking it one step further, DataCite has also implemented some functionality in their public-facing search so that you can look up data sets and other objects that are in DataCite and search for them by affiliation. So in this example here, if you were looking for all of the works that were affiliated with Imperial College London, that kind of query is possible now due to this integration that DataCite has built with ROR. So one of the things that I really want to stress, and that I think will also come through in what Ted talks about, is how ROR is really meant to be this kind of linking and connecting identifier that can help identify, not just identify the affiliations for publications and other research outputs, but to really support this kind of connectivity and search and discovery work to track down affiliations by institutions. So this example from DataCite is kind of walking you through how we see that happening in action. A similar kind of thing is going to happen in the coming months with Crossref metadata, which will kind of empower the same type of activity with publications from journals. So for those of you who might be interested in doing more or learning more about ROR, there are a few different options that you have. We have a community advisory group that meets every other month or so to share updates on the project, and also it's a chance for people to give feedback and to get involved in mini project groups if they're so inclined. You can also get in touch if you see something in ROR that you think needs to be changed, if there's an error in a record or something that needs to be corrected, or if you see that there's something that's not in ROR that you think should be in ROR, please let us know. We also have a mailing list if you want to receive periodic updates about what's going on with the project. And going further, I put a few links here. The slides, I think, are all, these slides that I'm sharing are all available from the Sketch profile, so you can grab the links there. But we have a website, we have a Slack discussion space, all of the code is on GitHub, and we try to post updates on Twitter as well. So that is my crash course in what's happening with ROR, and kind of teeing you up for Ted to take you on an adventure through the ROR data.
Okay, thanks so much, Maria. Are there questions? Maria's only going to be here for, she's got another meeting at 11, so she's just here. So this is we're having an intermediate Q&A.
Hi, I have a question about relationships. Like, are you capturing, trying to think of a good example of, so I'm at an institution or a university and there are two different scientific labs at the university. Are you capturing the relationships of this lab is at this university so I can make that relationship across the two different labs? Or is it just flattened where both of that information is captured in the one record?
That's a great question. Thank you. I meant to mention something about that and I neglected to, so appreciate your flagging it. At the moment, it is 100% flat. We don't have any relationality in the current iteration of the data set. Pretty soon, we will be able to support some basic parent-child and sibling relationships to allow us to associate, like in your example, a lab to a university, or a university system like University of California to one of its campuses. So that's something that will be supported soon. So even though we're not going deep into the university hierarchies, we do want to have some basic support for those kind of higher level relationships.
Hi, Maria. This is Mark Parsons from RPI. I have a sort of a related question. Well, actually sort of interlinked questions. One is, do you have a definition of what a research organization is? Mm-hmm. And then, and any sort of requirement as to who does the registering and then maintains the record? Mm-hmm. And then finally, is this all a centralized registry, or could it potentially be sort of a distributed registry like DOIs through the handle system or something like that, so that a university then could manage its own subunits?
Yeah, those are all great questions, Mark. So first question about what is a research organization. The notion here is really any organization that kind of touches research in some way, whether it's producing research, funding research, employing researcher, those kinds of basic basic kinds of engagements with the research process. You'll see if you kind of dive into the ROR data itself, there are a lot of organizations, there are a number of commercial organizations in the registry right now, because research organizations can take many forms. Sorry,
would funding agencies fall into that as well?
There are some funding agencies in the registry. That is correct. Yeah. So it can be a little bit slippery. It's it's something that I think we trying to establish some kind of boundary around it without being too slippery or too firm, really striking that balance. But I'd be curious to know, if you sort of take a sample of the different organizations that are in there to see, to see how that plays out. But it's really focused on the concept of, what are the organizations that, would be kind of displayed as an affiliation on a published research output, for instance, or as a funder of some kind of project, for instance.
Okay, we've got Don Collins is online, and he asked a similar question. Don, did Maria cover your question or answer your question? We cannot.
Okay, I think I see the question, yeah, in the chat. I think the organizational granularity. So, and I'm going to get back to Mark's other questions in a minute. So yeah, in terms of granularity, it's really focused primarily on what we would call a kind of top level. So a university, Ted will talk about federal agencies, a primary organization. There are, a number of cases that we have, with research centers and institutes that are affiliated or part of an institution, or museums that are part of a university, for instance. So trying to support those, those kinds of separate entities as well. This kind of leads into getting back to Mark's question about how we kind of manage, to what degree we're sort of managing this centrally. And if I think I'm interpreting your question correctly, Mark, so we are developing workflows and processes with some of the members of the community advisory group that I mentioned, to kind of understand how to take in requests from organizations and determine how to validate them. So we are not at this time, it's all managed centrally at this time, and we're working closely with GRID to make updates to the data, because the two data sets are still linked while we develop independent workflows for ROR. And we're determining to what extent in the future we need to build in functionality for instance, for organizations to be able to manage their own data. At this point, that's not something that's on the immediate roadmap, but it's something that we're kind of keeping an eye on, and also looking to see what kind of input we hear from the community of users who are out there.
And then the final thing related to that is, do you have any sort of requirements as to who from the institution registers and maintains the record? Like I could just go off and create one for RPI, but that would probably.
Yeah, I mean, there probably is one already in that case, but it's that's one of the things that we're talking through at the moment. In many cases, it's kind of possible to validate that those kinds of requests with with an external source, like looking to a university's website, for instance, to see what kind of often they have guidelines around what is the official name of the university and things like that. So trying to look at the at those factual sources to determine it, rather than saying only one person can be authorized on behalf of an organization to make a request. In terms of what we've seen over the past year or so, since the registry was up and running, the kind of requests that I've seen come in have been from many people who are based in the libraries, some people who are working more on the research administration side of things with a university or institution. But I haven't really come across any instances yet in which there's sort of a conflict, in terms of, different competing sources of information about an institution. But it is a tricky thing that we're trying to, develop more concrete guidance and workflows on in conjunction with this community group.
I think, Matt, did you have a question?
So Maria, the grid data set was a great way to seed it, but we've also been trying to use them, and we found that a lot of our references need to be to repositories, which are oftentimes not top-level organizations.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered like importing all of the organizations from Re3 data, the research repository registry or something like that, just for that community? I think would really benefit from being present in the data set early.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a sense for the degree of overlap right now? Is it 0, or is there some overlap already?
No, it's not 0 for sure. There's definitely some there, but there are a lot of, I think ROAR and GRID both have much more institutional entries that are affiliated with bricks and mortar places, and repositories are oftentimes much more, maybe not project oriented, but somewhere between a project and a bricks and mortar place. So yeah, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's definitely something that we would want to support. So if there's, anyway, we should talk about that.
Maria, it just so happens that I'm doing some work with that Re3 data, and I'll be able to tell you which ones are already there and which ones aren't there yet in
Excellent.
probably the end of the week.
Okay, great.
Okay, any other questions? Okay, we have, thanks again so much, Maria, for coming and joining us this morning. And thanks, there are connections to ROAR, in Maria's talk, which is in the sketch, as she mentioned. And so that's another source of information and a source for input. So last summer at the meeting in Tacoma, we got into a discussion of ROAR sort of unexpectedly. And there were a lot of questions similar to the ones we asked today. And so I put together a Funding Friday proposal to try and start working with ROAR and ESIP. And this is sort of the report from that. This is a URL that goes to a category in the ESIP wiki. And that's a resource, hopefully, for research for ESIP members and participants to find ROARs. But I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction, and then we'll have some time to look at that and maybe discover some ROARs or ask other questions. And Maria, you're certainly welcome to stay with us if you'd like, and if not, then we will see you soon.
Thanks. I'll hang out for another 10 minutes or so and then hop over to my other meeting.
Great. Okay, so ESIP sponsors and members and ESIP, wait, hold on, just hang on for just a second. Oh, there it is, okay. ESIP members and participants can help connect ESIP to the world by using ROARs. And as we just saw a little demonstration, there actually are quite a few organizations around the world in multiple languages that have the acronym ESIP. And if we're going to connect ESIP to the world, we need to get the organization right. And similar to the UCB, oh wait, that's University of British Columbia. No, that's UBC. Oh, UCB, yeah, that's Berkeley, California. And it's similar to Maria's case. sometimes trying to find the right organization in affiliation strings can be challenging. So it turns out that ESIP is in ROR currently under the name Federation of Earth Science Information Partners and with this ROR. So the first goal of this project was to identify a ROR for ESIP, and we have succeeded in that, and now we know that. I wanted to talk a little bit about ESIP's role in the adoption of RORs. Many of you know that I've been working on adoption of various sandbox or issues for quite a while. Soapbox, I guess, not sandbox. So there's an idea around called positive deviance. And so this collection of red arrows here is employees or affiliates with various ESIP organizations. And as some of us know, they're headed in a bunch of different directions. So the idea of positive deviance is if it's an organizational change model, if you want to create change, you need to scale it down to the lowest level of granularity and look for people within the system who are already manifesting the desired future state. So these are called positive deviants. And we want to do is take only the arrows that are already pointing in the right direction and ignore the others, identify and differentiate those people and create mechanisms for them to communicate with one another, bring them together, aggregate them, give them visibility and resources, and then you've got a powerful arrow all going in the right direction. And as I think we heard earlier this morning in the discussion in the plenary, this is really what ESIP does across federal agencies and universities and other research-oriented entities. It's finding people in those agencies and in those members that come together and are already understanding the benefits of some element of change and pulling them off together. So this is sort of my idea of where we are. In ESIP, when I looked at the participation list last week, we had about 225 people registered. I'm not sure where we are now, more than that probably. And we've got a few of those people in this room. And the idea is that we can talk to about 140 organizations, which are members of ESIP. And we can go out and evangelize this idea of how important it is to identify themselves unambiguously, persistent identifiers, et cetera. Everybody knows everybody in ESIP knows the benefits of those. And then we talked yesterday about the sponsors of ESIP, 3 large earth science organizations in the US, USGS and NASA and NOAA, and we can go out and try and work with those sponsors. And then each of those sponsors has, or across the federal government, in addition to those sponsors, there are a lot of different agencies that are in the U.S. government. We know that the U.S. government has a lot of different agencies, and a lot of all of those agencies have different programs and offices and centers and research institutes, et cetera, inside of them. Of course, I should also mention that we were lucky to have 2 people from the Department of Energy here during this meeting, which was wonderful. So this is the model of taking these ideas and spreading them out through the members, through the sponsors, and into the broader U.S. Federal government. And so what I wanted to do for this project is to explore the ROR data set and find out, try and provide information to federal partners about what's there, rather than sort of, they can certainly poke around in the registry and find some things, and I tried to take a little bit of a more systematic look at it. So one thing that's a problem, and we saw this a little bit in Maria's talk and then in mine, is people, as Maria mentioned, when people are submitting papers or creating metadata or registering for ESIP, they type in some string, which is called we call an affiliation string, and in a lot of cases they put in acronyms into those strings. We saw already some interesting organizations that have the ESIP acronym. So what about NSF? There are a number of people in this room who have worked with NSF for a while, and if you put NSF into ROR, actually only showing 9 answers here, but one is the National Sanitation Foundation International. the National Sleep Foundation. There are some things from Norway, and down here in the lower right is the National Science Foundation. But on the lower left, there's the National Science Foundation of Sri Lanka. And it turns out that many countries, believe it or not, around the world have national science foundations, and somehow they all have an acronym called NSF. So just like when you're using acronyms in your papers to, explain jargon to people in scientific papers, you have to type out the acronyms. You have to spell those things out if you want automated systems to be able to find a ROR. Or you can look up your ROR here and you don't need to use the system, but acronyms in affiliations are challenging. They're also non-unique names. So it turns out that there are 778 names in the ROR database that have multiple RORs associated with them. And this is not a surprise to us because this is actually the problem we're trying to solve, right? Ambiguous identifiers for multiple organizations, multiple entities that have the same identifier. So in this case, the names, the Ministry of Health, I think has 54 different RORs associated with it. So Maria mentioned that there's some metadata in the current ROR database that you can use along with one of these strings to try and make sure you get the right ROR, or you have the organization in the right country. And as I said, these are used 2,090 times out of roughly 100,000 things. So about 2% of the organizations in the ROR database have multiple organizations with the same name. And of course, one of those that I found most interesting, everybody here knows the National Center for Supercomputer Applications, which is a big supercomputing applications. Is that what I said? Oh, National Center for Supercomputing Applications. Dan happens to work there. And I never knew that he actually works in Bulgaria. I thought he worked in Illinois. Oh, there is one in Illinois, but there is also one in Bulgaria. So even organization names that we think are long and must be unique actually turn out not to be unique, or some of them. So this is one of the things that you need to be aware of when you're searching for a ROR using an organization name. And Maria mentioned the affiliation service that they're now providing, and I developed some of those similar capabilities when I was working with the Dryad case that she talked about. And being aware of these multiple non-unique names is something that you need to be careful when you only have the string that someone typed into a journal input system. So I mentioned the ESIP wiki. There is a category of pages there. There are 3 or 4 pages in the category, and we'll take a look at them, but they have ESIP federal RORs, ESIP member RORs that came from the names that are in the membership list, and then participant RORs. And this is going to be at the end for questions. So now we can go to this URL. Let's see. And it looks like this. It looks like this. Okay, so can people get to this and take a look at it? A lot of the questions that came up, I was happy that some of those questions were the same questions that I had. We have at the top of this page our beautiful Funding Friday poster. And this is a category in the wiki is a way for holding together related pages. So the first one in this at the highest level that we talked about is the US federal RORs. So finding US federal agencies is a challenge using names. And that's what part of the goal of this is to make it easier for people that are either funded by or working in federal agencies to find RORs. And there's a discussion in here about sort of ways that we look that I use to try and find these things. One thing that's interesting is that and I think that ROR will be able to take advantage of this, in the GRID database, there is actually one level of parent-child organization names. So Grid has done their best. I was lucky to be able to find a mistake in their hierarchy for NOAA and sent in an email, and they corrected that. So there is some information there, but to find these, I started out by just searching for .gov, either .gov URLs, because the ROR database includes URLs, or also there are many gov. Something like gov.au for Australia. So I looked at those, and that worked to a certain extent for finding these. And then in some cases, I know something about these agencies, so I was able to look around and, for instance, in the Department of Energy, find the labs, the research labs, the national labs that are around that generally don't have energy. Well, that's another thing about the Department of Energy. It has DOE.gov and energy.gov. This is a list of 8 or 9 federal agencies, high-level agencies with their RORs, and then in the count column, there's the number of RORs that were identified for each of these agencies. Mark and Don both asked about granularity, and so I took NOAA, which is an organization that I'm fairly familiar with, and started sort of digging around using things that I knew about NOAA, and also using the parent-child relationship in the GRID database to try and define how far down the hierarchy in NOAA the ROR goes. Because Maria mentioned that, you know, the goal in ROR is, as we move forward, to sort of start out at the higher levels, and maybe at some time in the future, unspecified, you know, sort of go deeper. But of course, the existing GRID database has some of those deeper things already, and we're not going to throw them away. They all have RORs currently. But so the idea here is, if you, let's see, who's here? I don't see anybody. Oh, there's one person from NOAA in the back. Who works at NCEI. So NCEI is inside of NESDIS, and here is National Centers for Environmental Information. So this is a data center. Everybody knows it's a repository, actually, like Matt mentioned, and this is the ROR that either a data set that's created or a person who is working with NCEI can use this ROR. And if you're or people that are working in fisheries, we had a couple of people here from fisheries this week. The various science centers, National Ocean Service has a number of organizations inside of it. So this is sort of looking across the government, the total government structure, and trying to find RORs and just sort of seeing empirically how deeply they go. This data set is in Figshare. And you can get the list of all, however many there are altogether, 157, 200, whatever, about 300 of these. And so if you're in a federal agency, one of these others I just did this for NOAA as an example, there are RORs in this data set. So we can use this. Here's a pointer to the data. We can use this by either finding the organization that you're in, or finding the closest neighbor to your organization currently in the ROR list. And as these RORs get further populated, we'll have some resources somewhere to try and increase the granularity at some point. Yeah.
A clarifying question. So RORs currently don't handle hierarchies, but there's nothing that says you can't have RORs for subunits of a unit. So I could make a ROR for the Tetherless World Constellation, even though Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute already has a ROR.
You could.
And we just don't get that relationship is all.
Right.
So there's no really limits on the granularity. We're just not capturing the relationships.
Yeah, I don't know if Maria is still here, but yeah, Yes, and so what I'm doing here is sort of empirically looking at how deep people have already gone in these agencies. And in universities, there are also not, Tetherless World is a good example because it's sort of like, it's not really a department, it's sort of like a center and an institute or something like that. And there's a lot of institutes that are associated with universities that already have RORs, all kinds of them. So, and yeah, so there's no like the buzzer goes off when you submit that and your disk is erased because you tried to get a ROR for a unit inside of something that already has a ROR. Yeah,
I'm just thinking from
I don't think,
sense of ESIP membership, most of the ESIP members are more at that subunit level.
okay, so we lost Maria, but and she's a much better representative of like ROR Central than I am. But you mentioned universities and ESIP members. So let's take a look at ESIP members. I went to the ESIP member list and took the names that were in that list and looked for RORs for them. So this is the kind of thing that I'm doing now to try and help organizations find out about RORs. And in the ESIP case, we have 140, maybe 150 or so members. And on this page is a list of the members for which we got one ROR. These algorithms that are searching RORs, either the one that they're supporting or the ones that I'm using multiple algorithms because some of them work in some cases and some of them work in other cases, and you need to be able to compare them. But so we have a number of members of ESIP that have RORs here, which is great. And as Mark said, some of them are lower level, but here's an example. For instance, the Bren School at UCSB, I'm sorry, University of California, space Santa Barbara, where the university has a ROR, but right now it looks like the Bren School doesn't. The what? Tetherless? Yeah.
So Ted, try click on the JPL one that showed up like we turned it down, which is
Here.
well, first it's not right. It says it's a group, but is that ROR the group?
Wait, this is the ROR for the Jet Propulsion Laboratory.
So like Tetherless World resolves to the RPI ROR, it's not its own ROR.
Right.
Well, but the NCSA one resolves to NCSA, not to ONA.
Okay. Not to what? Not to Illinois? Yeah. When I created this data, there's two things out here on the right-hand side of these tables. There's something called warnings. Oops. Sorry, this mouse pad is the opposite of mine. So, and warnings are things like acronyms. So this is an interesting one. Earth Data Discovery Consortium, ESIP, New Media Studio Research Institute. New Media Studio, some of you probably know, is Bruce Caron's company. It's been around for 1 million years, and it actually has a ROR, but none of the algorithms could find the ROR is actually under New Media Studio, and because this name has research and institute in it, it brings in a whole bunch of other things. New Media Studio shows up about 13th on the list, but ESIP, the acronym for ESIP, is picked up, and so in this case we get ESIP for this one. So I didn't try and clean this list up and make these changes because I wanted to sort of show what the problems are, what some of the challenges are when we're trying to find these RORs, and the kinds of things that Dan just brought up is one. Another, for instance, is EarthCube. So in one of the algorithms for doing this, we take advantage of a lookup table that I created, that I curate. So I know that EarthCube is National Science Foundation, and maybe it should be National Science Foundation EAR or GEO, or is it EAR? Oh, okay, so we'll stick with NSF on that. I mean, I'm National Science Foundation, but yeah, I wanted to leave this here. And Dan, you said NCSA is in Bulgaria. Is it down below? Anyway, and let me finish sort of displaying this. So yeah, here's National Center for Supercomputing Applications as multiple RORs. This one is actually the one in the US.
My my comment was just that you're pulling up the one for NCSA, not the one for University of Illinois, which is the larger one.
Yeah, yeah.
The flip side, Netherlands World Constellation goes to RPI.
Right. Well, this is why we have this project and why I'm talking to you guys. And I want you to know sort of also, there's a lot of data people in here, so getting a handle on what the kind of problems are that you might run into. There are other cases where we get two affiliations. So here's one for ASDC at Langley, Atmospheric Sciences Data Center. And in this case, I pick up Langley Research Center and I also pick up NASA. So it's possible that groups in ESIP may have actually multiple RORs. Someone might want to do a Langley research, NASA's the higher element in the hierarchy. We may want multiple ones, and there are a lot of those. And NASA's getting picked up from the acronym in these cases. So we get an acronym warning there that I produce because there's a lot of funny acronyms. And then Langley Research Center is getting picked up from the string.
What is the common curation?
Curation, that's down here somewhere. So curation means that the affiliation string 1 North College Street, Circ B, has nothing to do with Carleton College. And except I know that Circ is at Carleton. I am curation. Curation is HILTL, H-I-T-L, HITL, human in the loop. And in that case, I'm the human and says, okay, I know this is Circ, but notice that Circ also gets picked up here by Connecticut State Emergency Response Commission. So in this case, the warning is the one that's picked up by the algorithm is actually Circ. And I said, oops, sorry, that's curation. Another thing, the WRAP program, Wildfire Research and Application Partnership, there's nothing in that string that tells us what this might be. But if you Google it and look around for WRAP, you find out that it's a cooperative program at Ames. And there is something called WRAP in the United Kingdom. So as in any case, there's this thing called machine learning around. And sometimes machine learning helps us and sometimes it doesn't. And the same thing is true. I would hesitate to call the code that I wrote machine learning, but human learning anyway. You want to look through these things and use the human in the loop to make sure that they're right. Then down here at the bottom, there are quite a number of organizations in ESIP that I was currently unable to find RORs for, and this may be because of the way that they're written and maybe because they're not there. So these are the organizations that in ESIP that we might want to try and work with ROR to create RORs for these organizations in the registry. Mark? Well, you're a weedy guy. Ben? Pardon me?
You have National Snow and Ice Data Center is not having a ROR, but then up above you have it having 3 RORs.
Yeah, it has a University of Colorado ROR and it has.
Oh, and it has a series ROR.
Yeah, it has a series ROR.
But it doesn't have one for itself.
And the affiliation string National Snow and Ice Data Center parentheses NSIDC actually doesn't resolve to a ROR.
Well, but there it is in the one with 3 RORs, National Snow and Ice Data Center parentheses NSIDC.
Okay, remember I'm scrolling upside down here, so.
Nope, you did, go back the other way, right there.
I have a ROR here for series, I have a ROR here for NASA, and I have a ROR here for University of Colorado.
Right, but it says National Snow and Ice Data Center parentheses NSIDC, and then if you go down to the missing ones.
Yeah, there is no organization. If you put only NSIDC, what's happening in this is University of Colorado is getting a ROR. And this is a curation one because I know that NSIDC is NASA and it's also NOAA, of course. And so here is one that I inserted, but the ones that the algorithm found were Ceres and, Cooperative Institute for Research in Environmental Sciences and.
I guess I'm
University of
just saying
Colorado.
that it's inconsistent, and I guess maybe that's
Oh,
because
it's-
tetherless world.
Wait, there's data in this world that's inconsistent? I think Sarah was first.
Okay, I'll be quiet.
Yeah. I put that one there especially for you, Mark, so you don't need to be quiet, but. One of the things about the granularity that exists in the grid database currently is it's not systematic, it's random. Right? Sarah?
So I'm afraid this question might take us off the conversation. So if someone else has a related question after I read my question, maybe we can hop back to it. But I recently went through a similar process for our institution. I work at CSAR, System for Earth Sample Registration, where we collect information about the repository where the samples are stored. And I used OpenRefine, cleaned the data to get these unique names, created a lookup table, did all of that. And I'm wondering about the relationship, given the work with Dryad, as far as, so who registers the institution in ROAR? Would I allow people to start entering things and have a connection to ROAR so that when they enter a new data set, it gets registered in ROAR? Or is it, now that I have this cleaned lookup table, can I go and register all these places in ROAR and then put the ROAR identifier in our system for future when the next person comes in and goes to look something up?
If you look on the next page that we haven't gotten to yet, which is the participants ROARs. Remember, we started at the federal government, then we went for members and participants. There is information that ROAR would like from your organization to register a new ROAR. And that is actually information that gets transmitted to GRID. And so decisions about new ROARs are really, at this point, still decisions about new grids. And there is some information about that on the GRID website. Matt actually turned me on to this, and he had an easy time. I'm still working on it. But they're very helpful. But the problem is that one of the reasons that they're taking this data set and making it open to the, open is because they want help sort of curating it. Matt.
Yeah, submitting to GRID is really pretty reasonable, and ROAR hasn't really worked out their process yet fully. So once you get it into GRID, it'll show up in ROAR within 3 or 4 months. So basically, I think they do quarterly updates from GRID to ROAR. But my point was about this thing about the NSIDC and the affiliation with the funding agencies. I think, one of the challenges you just mentioned was that NSIDC is funded by both NOAA and NASA. And so I think we need to differentiate this idea that there are properties affiliated with an institution or an organization and containment of those within something else. So to say that NSIDC is within NOAA is probably wrong, or to say that it's within NASA is probably wrong.
Did I say within?
It is within probably, I don't know, Mark, you could probably answer this better. Like, is it the University of Colorado that it's administratively within? But then it has a funding relationship to these other, which can change over time.
Right.
And, right. But I guess my point here, notwithstanding the specific example, is that containment should be really associated with very tight relationships, like saying that, the Department of Biology is within the University of California, Santa Barbara makes sense, right? But saying that, something like the Arctic Data Center, which is currently administered within the University of California, Santa Barbara, is not necessarily a long-term immutable thing. Like the Arctic Data Center may in fact move somewhere else in the future.
Right.
So
it should exist. Okay, we're going to get to Dan, but these are the questions. I mean, I'm not up here saying that all of the questions about ROARs have been answered by ROAR. And this is exactly the question. When people say we want more hierarchy, you talk to Martin Fenner, who's the, infrastructure lead on this sort of at DataSite, and he just runs out of the room screaming, because when you go from this high level down to the lower level, and then you go to these institutions, and then you go to NSF projects that have 20 different PIs, and then, it's a very hairy mess. So Dan?
So I guess maybe I was going to say something similar to Matt, but slightly different. That is that this is a scheme for organizations.
Right.
Right. But ESIP members are not all organizations.
Right.
So I feel like the problem here is that we're trying to map ESIP members, which are not organizations, into something that is organizations.
Yeah, I would say what we're trying to do is find ESIP members that ROAR believes are organizations. And, pardon? We are definitely going to have members like of ESIP that don't have ROARs, and that's okay. I'm not saying that all members of ESIP must have ROARs, but if we're looking at the participants, the other thing I'm trying to do here is help ESIP members understand that when they put in their affiliations as NASA SSAI or NASA EED2/Raytheon or NASA EED2 no spaces /Raytheon, that we have a hard time figuring out where they're coming from. And so I want them to be able to, or take NSIDC. There could be 5 people from NSIDC at ESIP in a perfect world, and some of them might actually want, for the work that they're doing, to have a series affiliation or a NASA affiliation or a NOAA affiliation. So that's okay. I'm not saying that all ESIP members are organizations. Steve.
Kind of really just some sort of comments on this. I mean, one is it's fascinating, and I realize what a mess real life data really is. Yeah. Anybody who's ever tried to do any data cleanup on anything kind of comes across the same sorts of things. The real world is a mess. It doesn't fit into neat little hierarchies, and hierarchy is the wrong thing for. I would suggest is the wrong thing for this. Many organizations are slightly hierarchical, but there are also weird structures that
Right.
go around as well. So I think this is important stuff. I looked at my own little name badge, and I've got NASA on today, but I'm also a contractor with SSAI working for NASA. But I noticed that all of my colleagues have written something different on their badge. NASA ESDIS. Sometimes I have NASA Earth Science Data Systems Working Group project, or different variations of that. So I hear everything you're saying, and I appreciate the hard work in this, because data in the real world is a mess.
Right.
And what we're talking about is not necessarily trying to reproduce organizational structures. That's not the job of ROAR, to represent what the structure of an organization is. It's what somebody might reference in their paper, which is not necessarily how the organization is structured. That's kind of not necessarily relevant. It's how they relate to the people that are writing the papers, I guess.
Right.
Which
or
may be,
creating data sets.
right. Which may be different to the strict, organizational structure.
Right.
It's a mess.
Just to finish, one other thing that's relevant to this discussion is on each of these pages, I have, participant affiliations with one ROAR. And notice I said participant affiliations, not participants, right? So I understand this. And then I have participants with multiple ROARs. Oh, HDF, of course, is an interesting one. When we ran this algorithm originally, I came up with HDF format. And now it came up with hereditary disease foundation. So this happens to be a place where I worked for a while, and I didn't realize we were working on hereditary diseases. But and then down here at the bottom, we have affiliation diversity. So this is really the problem that we're trying to get at with ROARs, where we have multiple affiliation strings that all resolve to one ROAR. And of course, NASA is the king of diversity, or the queen of diversity. A lot of different ways that people say NASA. Someone actually wrote it down, the complete name, and that's wonderful. But so the things that I try and do with a pile of affiliations is find the ones that, and I'm using multiple algorithms sort of simultaneously, trying to find the ones that everybody agrees on, trying to find warnings that we should have about acronyms or multiple names, and then affiliation diversity. And what I'm the end or a milestone along this road. Maria mentioned the data site and Crossref also both have the capability of putting organizational identifiers into their metadata scheme now. And my goal is to develop algorithms here that we understand well enough that we can use them confidently in those repositories to actually start assigning identifiers to existing affiliations, because it's time, I think, for the repositories to take that role of augmenting and starting to build that PID graph. And that's the thing with what Steve said. I understand that this is not a hierarchy, and the model that people are using for dealing with this is a graph. It's called the PID graph. And that's so that it's really the graph that we're trying to build. So this is the initial report from this first attempt. Annie.
Great. I think this is awesome. And I mean, just from a, nonprofit staff perspective, or anyone running an organization that has funding, it's always who's participating and how do we measure impact. And so the 50 different NASA affiliations, even when you're trying to do a simple who came to the meeting, and then you're just doing like a control F search for the word NASA. I mean, it would just, these are the types of things in a membership organization that just from an administrative perspective, when you're trying to write annual reports, put together quarterly metrics on who's participating, who's showing up, that they're the tricky kind of contractor relationships in the federal government, but just purely from a engagement and who's on calls, who's showing up to meetings, and keeping a database that's somewhat clean in terms of a like content management system of where people are showing up, who should we be tapping to bring up in leadership, that all of this stuff matters. And I can't imagine there's any membership organization in the world across domains that doesn't deal with this exact same problem.
Right. And my hope is at the summer meeting, we'll have a system like by the way, Annie, this is my hope. Yeah, that we'll have a system like was developed at Dryad, where when people are registering through CVent for ESIP, they can get a ROR automatically. They'll have an option of having a ROR assigned to their organization name.
Yeah, and I had one more before Dan, I passed the mic away. I had one more comment related to just the, I guess, somewhat of, and this is feedback maybe for partnership and how a governance thing, and especially relates to the lab, which I have a particular interest in, is when we give money away and we say part of it is you have to participate or be affiliated with an ESIP organization. A lot of people come in, we get people through universities. So say it's the Earth Science Department with the University of Montana, and we say to be eligible to receive funding from us, you have to be affiliated with an ESIP partner organization. Well, anyone that's employed by the University of Montana, you can't, the Earth Science Department isn't the employer. The University of Montana is an employer. So just as we're thinking about, as we evolve as an organization, who is affiliated with ESIP, or how that works, or are you eligible to receive, a couple $1,000s from us that maybe just in a governance role. I think for a long time it was sure a department can join, but does that mean someone in the genomics department is also affiliated with an ESIP partner organization? So again, from the staff and management of a member organization, especially on the financial side and discounted rates of joining a meeting, these things matter. So
yeah,
that's it.
So I guess I was thinking about this as having some overlaps with some of the citation things, and in particular the fact that there's implicit human knowledge that's in here that we're not asking about and we're trying to guess at effectively. So I looked at my registration for this meeting. My badge says University of Illinois, and I'm listed as a partner in my registration, but University of Illinois is not an ESIP partner, and CSA is. So I think there's at least 3 different things that we could ask about, right? One is what organization pays you. Another is what organization do you feel like you're representing? And another could be what project do you feel like you're representing? And for each of these, there could be multiple. So I understand the idea of RORs, but I feel like some of the things that we're trying to automate may not be automatable.
Right. Well, I mean, the organization of this session was really sort of an introduction of ROR, and then an attempt to apply ROR to our organization and see, surface these kinds of questions. And so that's exactly why we're here, to try and identify how this can benefit us and what the challenges are, and the pitfalls along the way that we need to be careful of and aware of. And then feedback to ROAR as they try and build this community of practice. This is a great, ESIP is a great example of such a community. And I know that ROAR is going to be interested in the feedback that we provide.
So sort of on the flip side of what Dan was just saying, and kind of related to what Steve was saying, is, so yeah, we can't automate all of this, but then if as you suggested, during ESIP registration, people indicate their affiliation and then they can automatically get a ROAR, we're going to get all sorts of conflicting ROARs because people identify in all sorts of different ways. And
Yeah, well, I mean,
I think that would just add to the mess, not actually help clean the mess.
well, yeah, here, actually in the participation data set, this is where it tells you about the information that would be helpful when you're trying to get a new ROAR. And we only had a small number here of participation affiliations that didn't actually end up with ROARs. But yeah, so I mean, we talked yesterday about fairness and evaluating fairness, and there's a lot of questions about how do we do this, and I think in this case there are a lot of questions about how we adopt identifiers for organizations in the real world, and it is messy, and but I think it's a mess that we need to try and solve. And thank God I'm not trying to do this for ORCID, or even the department level. The complexity of this sort of goes up exponentially, right? When you go from organization names to department names to institutes to centers to program names to individual names. I mean, ORCID is a freaking mess. Trying to find an ORCID for a human is very difficult.
But the nice thing about humans is it's fairly unambiguous what the thing is.
Well, not
Whereas
necessarily.
an organization is
If your name happens to be Ted Haberman, or I'm sorry, Ray Haberman, or Ray Edward Haberman.
No, I understand what you're saying, but it's fairly unambiguous that you are that human there.
Yeah, but if you're
you might have the same name as many other humans, but you are a unique human.
If you're searching, you should talk to Matt about this. If you're searching for Jones, it's a lot different than Parsons and Haberman, right?
Yeah, no, I get that.
Okay,
but
so
what is the thing is the question. That's what, it's unambiguous what that thing is.
Yeah, right.
But
okay, yeah. So it's 11:30. Thank you so much. And these are wiki pages. I created them on the wiki so people can contribute to them. And if they find ROARs, we can add them in. That's fine. And hopefully this will be an ongoing project. And I'm going to clean up. My next thing I'll do is find some of these problems that you guys identified and that I identified in this list, and try and get this to be more of a level 2 product instead of a level 0 product at this point. But stay tuned, and thanks again, and safe travels.
And if you're interested in this weird concept of trying to identify things, stick around to the next session this week.
Yeah, is that the research object identifier? Yeah, yeah. Okay, thanks a lot. Let's see.